All right, everybody, thank you for joining us. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 9:30. So we are going to be talking about the 25-26 FAFSA, kind of doing a deep dive on the FAFSA and some things to expect when you're coaching students on the FAFSA. This presentation is going to be led by Ginger McBride and Danielle Sullivan. So I'm going to turn it over to you all. Ginger, Danielle, you ready?
Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Sullivan, and today we're going to be covering the 25-26 FAFSA. We're going to be doing a deep dive. We'll take you underwater, and I swear we'll bring you back up by the end. This is the first of our training series that we have for you throughout the year out of our 4 trainings that we'll be doing for you on financial aid topics put on by the Kansas Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or CASFA. And I work at Johnson County Community College. And Ginger, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ginger McBride, and I work in financial aid at Washburn University.
All right, so today we're going to cover a variety of topics. We're going to give you a brief introduction to the FAFSA, and then Ginger's going to talk to you about the studentaid.gov account, formerly known as the FSA ID or Federal Student Aid Identification. She'll talk about that setup process, and then we'll talk about filing the 25-26 FAFSA, including some screenshots on what you can expect to see. We'll go over briefly some types of financial aid that will be available once the FAFSA is completed. And then we'll talk about what actually happens next after the FAFSA is completed, and then give you some more information and training. So as Kevin stated, this session will be recorded. The slides will also be available within a couple of weeks as well on the CASFA website, so you can check back for that later. There's a lot of information on these slides, so you don't need to memorize anything or try to write things down quickly. The slides will be available for later. So before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about how to ask questions. So as we move through the material, go ahead and put your question in the chat, and then Kevin will be answering those throughout the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity to take yourself off mute and ask questions in an open forum setting. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So the FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. It's available online at studentaid.gov. And for the 25-26 year, it's going to be available beginning December 1st. That's been a change the past couple of years. In prior years, it was always available October 1st. They eventually will try to move back towards that opening date, but for now, the opening date is going to be December 1st. Students are going to use their 2023 tax information to file the 25-26 FAFSA. And yes, they have to file every single year that they're wanting financial aid. In addition, some schools do have priority dates or deadlines for filing the FAFSA so that the student can be considered for the best financial aid package possible. So as you're working with students, make sure that they are paying attention to any kind of priority dates or deadlines from individual institutions. So this is a slight change from how we remember it if you've been in this game for more than 2 years. If you're brand new, then it's great. You don't have any bad information to try to forget and relearn. So the FAFSA is a role-based form. So what that means is that each person has their own role. They have to log in individually and complete their own section. The student cannot complete the parent section, and the parent cannot complete all of the student section. So once the person logs in, they will be asked to essentially define who they are, either the student or the parent. And then once they select their role, there are a series of about 4 onboarding videos that will go through the FAFSA, how to navigate it, and some frequently asked questions. We will come back to this. This is a lot of words on a slide, so remember these will be available later. But this is brand new, beginning last year. The IRS Direct Data Exchange will automatically pull over tax data from the IRS and put it on the FAFSA. On the left, you can see everything that will be transferred directly from the IRS. So as long as the parent or the student is in the system, and sometimes they're not, it will automatically be pulled over seamlessly. They don't have to click on anything necessarily to get that to transfer. They simply provide their consent and approval, and then it will automatically happen in the background. Sometimes even parents thought they were doing something wrong because the FAFSA didn't go through all the questions, and we'll go through that later. But all of these elements will directly pull over. The only time that the tax information will not be able to be transferred, there are certain situations where the marital status does not match the tax filing status. So the person is married, but they filed a single return or head of household. Anytime that status doesn't match, it will not pull over. If the person did not file taxes in a U.S. territory, I'm sorry, if they filed taxes in a U.S. territory or a foreign country, it won't pull over those, of course, if they have not filed a tax return or if they're the victim of identity theft. So those are the instances where the direct data exchange will not work and they will have to enter their information manually.
All right, talking about studentaid.gov accounts, Danielle mentioned earlier, you may be used to hearing about
So now I'm
these.
going to turn it over to Ginger.
Thanks, Danielle. Are you able to hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry, I was getting a little worried there. Um, as far as the studentaid.gov accounts, this is what Danielle was mentioning was formerly referred to as your FSA ID or Federal Student Aid ID. So you may see that reflected if you're looking at different resources as one or the other. But when it comes to creating an account, each person who's adding information to the FAFSA needs their own account. So even if a dependent student is, providing assistance to their parent filling out that account, that parent needs their own account information in order to complete the parent section of the FAFSA. When creating the account, you're going to want to make sure that the name appears exactly the way it does according to the Social Security Administration. So using your Social Security card as a reference can help clear up any errors there. It's going to have you link an email address, which is required to complete the FAFSA electronically, and a phone number, which is optional, but is also very helpful to have as far as different account recovery options and logging in. Sometimes students will be creating their username and password for the studentaid.gov website, and they'll see a notice that says, hey, don't use your school email address. That's because students will be asked to log into this throughout the time that they're in college and even beyond. So using the high school email address that they've gotten so used to checking over the last 4 years may not be a long-term option if they're going to lose access to that account 6 months or so after they graduate from high school. So encouraging them to be mindful about maybe another email address that they won't lose access to as a result of graduating. It's not uncommon when I'm working with students to maybe even have to create one for the first time because they've just been using their school email address for so long. And then same thing with phone number. If they're going to get a new phone tomorrow, maybe wait until then to create that studentaid.gov account. And it will have each account with a unique email address and phone number. So two people can't be using the same phone number attached to their studentaid.gov account. And they'll verify that as they're logging in and completing the setup process. Last but not least, remembering your username and password as well as the challenge question answers, because you'll need to be able to log into the FAFSA each year that you're filling it out and potentially logging into the studentaid.gov website after that, as far as lifetime aid, things like that. We've got some screenshots here of the account creation steps, as well as some helpful tips about each one. Once we talked about the verifiable email address earlier, it must be verified. Sorry, your account must be created and verified by the Social Security Administration before it can be used to completely fill out the FAFSA. That includes things like providing the consent for the IRS data to transfer over. And so that can take 1 to 3 business days. We really encourage students to get that done ahead of when they want to file the FAFSA. That way, when they're sitting down at their high school completion event or maybe coming to a campus to do that, they can get all the way through it instead of like 90% of the way and then having to go back in later to do those extra steps once the account's verified. Students and anyone else who's creating an account will be asked to enter their name, date of birth, social security number. However, if someone doesn't have a social security number, they can check the box that says, I don't have a social security number. They'll also be asked to create a username, which can be used to log into the account as well as the phone number and email address that are affiliated with the account. And then, of course, creating and confirming a password. It's also going to ask for the mailing address, which is required for users who don't have a social security number, and entering your mobile phone number. But if you don't have a mobile phone number for the United States, you would leave that field blank. It's also going to ask about communication and language preferences. So as far as any required communication, whether the user would prefer to receive that via email or postal mail. As far as optional communications, whether they want to receive it via email or text message, and then language preferences from the drop-down menu there. And so once they've selected all of those options, they'll be able to continue with the account creation. There's also going to be some challenge questions, so that way, if they are trying to log in and can't remember their password, they can hopefully use those to regain access to their account. And then it's going to have the person creating the account confirm and verify their information. As far as additional security measures, there is two-factor authentication or verification. And so that email address or that text-capable phone number can be used to provide that two-step verification when logging in. And then there's the option to log in with an authenticator app as well. So either using the QR code through an existing app they already have, or downloading an app if they want to start using an authenticator app for the first time. There are a few differences for people who are creating an account without a social security number. Once again, we looked at that I don't have a social security number box earlier in that step 1 of creating the account. It'll prompt these users to answer a series of knowledge-based identity questions, and if those are answered accurately, then the account is essentially verified right away. And so they'll be able to use it without that 1 to 3 business day delay for the Social Security Administration to verify the identity of the account creator. There is an additional step for the attestation and validation of identity. If the identity can't be verified through that knowledge-based question match, as far as the 24-25 FAFSA, that hadn't totally gotten off the ground yet. So we saw a lot of people going through this process at different points over the spring and summer. We'll just keep doing whatever they ask as far as once 25-26 launches. But this is, if someone was unable to answer those knowledge-based questions, this would be that backup. And so using a combination of documents and submitting those to ID verification at ed.gov, it'll be a 1 to 3 business day process to verify that as well. And then when it comes to some frequently asked questions about studentaid.gov account creation, sometimes we have students who are really ahead of the game and they already created their account, but have forgotten what that username and password is, or maybe the parents of dependent students who have created their own accounts or accounts for other students, and now that it's time to log in to file the 25-26 FAFSA, they don't have their account information. Although they can't create a new account because it's connected either your social security number or the identity verification process for non-social security number users, they can regain access to their existing account, ideally through recovering their username and password using those verified text, email, or challenge questions. If everything has changed since they set it up and they don't remember their challenge questions, they can also submit their documentation to verify their identity to studentaid.gov in order to fully recover access to their account. Like we mentioned earlier, it's ideal that people create their accounts at least 3 days before they want to file the FAFSA. That way there's enough time for the account to be verified. If they don't create their account with enough lead time, they can still start the FAFSA, but they won't be able to provide the consent for the IRS data to transfer or sign their form until the account's been verified. And if someone's having issues setting up their studentaid.gov account, they should work with the federal student aid administration. We'll have some resources at the end of different resources available. And of course, if they're with you at a FAFSA help night or with us at a FAFSA help night, we'll troubleshoot as much as we can. But sometimes people will approach us as financial aid administrators and say, "Hey, can you unlock my account?" We don't have that ability, and so ultimately, if it's really stuck, it's going to be through the federal student aid administration. Can someone else create my account for me? No, although most of the time we see this with like the absolute best intentions of just wanting to help make the process smoother for whoever's needing to contribute their information, whether it's a parent for a student or a student for a parent. It's really important that only the person whose account it is has their username and password. And that's because of the approval and consent, as well as signature needed for the FAFSA form, as well as other things through the federal student aid website. And along a similar vein, it's important for you to keep that information as confidential as possible, since it can be used for things like applying for federal student loans. Now, getting into the 2025-26 FAFSA itself. It's going to ask about student information if the student is the one who's starting the form. And so we've got screenshots from the prototype FAFSA, which we also have a link to at the end of the PowerPoint here. And so it's going to pull this information directly from the FSA ID, the studentaid.gov account that was created. It'll still be important to confirm that all of the information is showing up correctly, because it is way easier to correct it through the federal student aid website before you get further into the form, rather than needing to do it after the fact if the information from your FAFSA doesn't match the information when you applied to the college or university. It's also going to prompt the person who's logged into the FAFSA to provide the consent and approval that we've been talking about so much so far. And so the student and any additional contributors identified on the FAFSA need to provide the consent and approval in order for any information to be transferred over, including like the confirmation that there isn't any information for the IRS to transfer over. If any of the contributors, including the student, don't provide that consent and approval, then the student won't be eligible for federal student aid. When it's getting into the weeds of what is the consent and approval for, it's things like sharing the personally identifiable information provided on the FAFSA form with the IRS, having that tax information transferred from the IRS to the FAFSA form, allowing the U.S. Department of Education to use that federal tax information to determine the student's aid eligibility for federal student aid purposes. It's allowing the Department of Education to share federal tax information with higher education agencies and the schools listed on the FAFSA form. Not much we as a school can do about it without that information. And then allowing the Department of Ed to reuse the federal tax information on other FAFSA forms that the contributor is invited and chooses to participate on. So maybe a parent with multiple dependent students, or someone who is both a parent and a student themselves. These are screenshots of what that looks like. So there's that summary in the green text box, then it goes in depth, as well as some frequently asked questions. So if people aren't sure about that process and want to be knowing more about what exactly that consent and approval is for, they can consult those frequently asked questions. And then there's the buttons to either approve or decline. But once again, if any of the contributors decline to provide that consent and approval, the student will be ineligible for federal student aid. I realize I've been using the term contributors a lot. That was a new term introduced for the 2024 FAFSA that is continuing for 2025-26. And that's anyone who's required to provide either information, a signature, consent, and approval to have their federal tax information transferred from the IRS to the FAFSA. And the information is used to determine a student's aid eligibility for federal financial aid. That being said, contributors who are identified on the FAFSA are not financially responsible for a student's educational expenses. So if a student is determined to be dependent and doesn't have any of the mitigating circumstances or personal circumstances that we'll be talking about a little later, they do need to have that parent information on the FAFSA in order to be eligible for all types of federal financial aid. And so even if the parent is saying, I'm not providing any financial support, that information is still required on the FAFSA form. Looking at who is and who is not a contributor, the student is always going to be a contributor on their FAFSA. If they're required to provide parent information, that could be their biological or adoptive parent or parents. If a student is married, it would be their spouse instead of any biological or adoptive parents. And if a student's required to put parent information on the FAFSA and that parent is married, it's going to include that parent's spouse's information as well. People who we see students trying to add on the FAFSA but who are not contributors include non-adoptive grandparents, foster parents. If a student is engaged but not yet married, their fiance is not a contributor. And if they are only required to put one parent's information on the FAFSA based on the series of questions that it asks, then they are not going to put that other parent on the FAFSA if the parents aren't married and don't live with each other. As far as identifying who needs to include a contributor, those are going to be based on things like whether the student is considered a dependent student, their marital status, and their tax filing status. And students are going to be considered a dependent student unless for the 2025-2026 FAFSA, they were born before January 1st, 2002. This year gets updated every year. If they're a veteran or an active duty military member, if they're married, if they have their own children or dependents, if both parents are deceased, if they were in foster care after the age of 13, or a dependent/order of the court after age 13, if they're an emancipated minor, if they're in a legal guardianship as determined by a court in the state where they reside, or if they're homeless or at risk of being homeless or have unusual circumstances. If the student can't answer yes to any of these questions, then they must report parent information on the FAFSA, even if they are self-supporting. When it comes to reporting that parent information for someone who couldn't answer yes to any of those questions, parent is defined as either the biological or adoptive parent, and it starts by asking if the student's parents are married to each other. If the answer is yes, then they're going to provide information for both of their parents. If the parents aren't married but live together, they're still going to provide information for both of the parents because they're sort of viewed as one household for FAFSA filing purposes. If the parents are married, if the parents are not married and they don't live together, it's going to ask if one parent provided more financial support for the student over the past 12 months. And if that's the case, and the parent has not remarried, then they're going to be asked to provide information for that parent only, the parent who provided more financial support over the last 12 months. Same scenario, but the parent has remarried, the step-parent information must also be included in the student's FAFSA form. Even if they weren't married in 2023, which is that base year for that income information, income and tax information, if they are married at the time that they're filing the FAFSA, they're going to be asked to provide that information for the step-parent. If the parents aren't married, don't live together and provide equal financial support, then the student is going to be asked to identify the parent with the greater income and assets. And similarly, if that parent has remarried, it's going to require the information from that step parent as well. So this is what the screen looks like when students are being asked to input the information for their parent or parents on the FAFSA. It's going to ask for first and last name, date of birth, social security number, if applicable, an email address. I really encourage students to either bring that person with them if they can, or have that information with them so that they accurately add this, since it will try to link up the information they've added with that person's studentaid.gov account. And if there isn't an exact match, sort of miss each other. Speaking of that studentaid.gov account, when identifying who must set up an account and provide consent, it's going off of whether the people who are identified as the parents were married and filing jointly in 2023. So if we follow the flow chart here, if the parent is married or remarried, then it'll be going off of if they filed their taxes jointly in 2023. And if they did, only one parent needs to provide the approval and consent on behalf of those tax filers. If they filed separately, then both the parent and the parent's spouse will need to provide approval and consent. So the student always needs to be a contributor. If they're a dependent student, that parent will need to be a contributor. And then once again, if they're married and filed taxes jointly, only one parent's needing to have an account, log in and provide that approval and consent and sign the form. If they didn't, then that'll be a step for the parent's spouse to complete as well. And then this is what the parent contributor email will look like. So we'll come back to the parent sections a little later, but if the email address that they input is valid, this will be what pops up for that parent. And then they can follow the link to log in and go through the steps that we'll review a little later. In some cases, we know that students can't provide parent information, even if they would otherwise be an independent student. And so we'll have its own deep dive with the professional judgment and special circumstances that students may go through at the different schools that they're applying to and attending. That'll be March 4th from 9:30 to 11 a.m. And same as this presentation, it'll be recorded and available if you aren't able to make it at that time. But you can check out caspa.org for registration information. When it comes to filling out the FAFSA based on those personal circumstances, just a quick reminder that if students meet the criteria to be independent, then they aren't going to be asked to provide any contributor information for a parent. When it comes to a student who is homeless or at risk of homelessness, it specifically asks if at any time on or after July 1st, 2024, was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. If the answer is yes, it'll ask if any of the following individuals or agencies have made a determination that the student was homeless or at risk of being homeless. If they do have a determination from a director or designee of an emergency or transitional shelter, street outreach program, homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving those experiencing homelessness, the student's high school or district homeless liaison or designee, the director or designee of a project supported by a federal TRIO or Gear Up program grant, or a financial aid administrator, then it will tell them that they are an independent student. If none of those apply, it will let them know that they're a provisionally independent or unaccompanied homeless youth. And so it'll still let them proceed without parent information while they're filling out the rest of the FAFSA, but they will definitely have some additional steps to complete through the institutions that they're sending their FAFSA to. There may still be additional steps for anyone who is identified as an independent student, and even a dependent student. We'll get into that when we're talking about what happens after you file the FAFSA form. But this is the sort of flow chart of, depending on if they answer yes to the student homelessness question and whether any of the recognized individuals have made a determination whether they'll be seeing the sign that says they're independent or whether they're provisionally independent. And like I mentioned, we have that list of who can make a homeless determination. If the student has received a documented determination from one of these individuals or authorities, then we may not, as a school, request additional documentation about the student status. If we do, sufficient documentation would include a documented phone call, written statement, or a verifiable, electronic data match. If a student is unable to provide documentation from at least one of these, then a financial aid administrator can review the student's circumstances and make a determination based on a written form or a documented interview with the student confirming that they're unaccompanied homeless youth or unaccompanied and at risk of homelessness and self-supporting. And this is without regard for the reason that the student is unaccompanied and or homeless. So there's no judgment as to why a student may be homeless or at risk of homelessness. It's purely looking at the circumstances and whether they fit that definition, and either saying yes, they do, or no, they don't. Related to, but separate from, whether a student is experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness and self-supporting are what we call unusual circumstances. And so those may include human trafficking, if they're legally granted refugee or asylum status, if they have experienced parental abandonment or estrangement, and if the student or parental incarceration, Situations that don't rise to the level of unusual circumstances for FAFSA filing purposes are if a parent is in the picture but just refuses to contribute their financial resources to your educational expenses, or refusing to provide information for the FAFSA itself. Although the language of being dependent or independent for FAFSA filing purposes is very similar to the language of dependence that you may claim on your taxes, those are actually completely independent from one another. So sometimes students will say, hey, now that I'm a sophomore, my parents aren't claiming on their taxes anymore. I'm an independent student for FAFSA filing purposes, right? Then we have to break the news that their parent or parents are still going to be involved if they don't meet any of those other circumstances to be an independent student. If a student says that they do have unusual circumstances, they'll be allowed to submit the FAFSA without parental information as a provisionally independent student, but they will need to follow up with the school so that a financial aid administrator can review their information and once again make a determination regarding their dependency. If a student doesn't have any unusual circumstances, but their parent is unwilling to provide information for the FAFSA, the parental information is skipped, and the student has the option to receive a direct unsubsidized loan only. However, we won't be able to review their eligibility for a Pell Grant or a subsidized loan. This is sort of a last resort for people who aren't considered independent and don't have any unusual circumstances or aren't at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. Sometimes students will accidentally say yes, and I joke and say it's form fatigue, because at this point, even though the FAFSA is shorter than it was 2 years ago, you've still answered a lot of questions in a very formal form that you may not have experienced before if you're a high school senior doing this for the first time. So I always encourage people to, take a break when they get to this question, take a breath, read it twice. If a student really is only applying for the unsubsidized loan because their parent isn't willing to contribute their information, they should work with their financial aid office to provide any additional documentation needed to verify that, because we don't want anybody, accidentally saying yes and then missing out on the other types of aid if it was just an issue with not reading the form thoroughly. Regardless of whether a student is considered dependent, provisionally independent, or independent, they're all going to be asked demographic questions. that do not affect their aid eligibility. This is specific to things like compiling aggregate data when they look at who is filing the FAFSA. Um, so it's going to ask about things like gender and race and ethnicity, citizenship, parent education status. That's even if a student is considered independent. So sometimes I've had students who get thrown off by that. Once again, this is not affecting their aid eligibility. It's just so that they can say X% of people um, fall into this category of FAFSA filers. It asks if they've had a parent killed in the line of duty, and it asks about their high school information and completion status. After they answer that information about their demographics, students will be asked a series of financial questions, and the marital status and tax filing questions will determine if there is a match with the IRS. So the marital status and tax filing status must match in order for the information to be transferred over. If there isn't a match, the student will need to enter in all their tax return information onto the FAFSA by typing it in manually. But if there is a match, the student will only be asked to enter information about their IRA/pension rollover amounts. If the answer is 0, that's okay, but they're going to be asked about it. Grants and scholarships that were reported on a tax return, which is rare. Foreign income exclusions, which is also rare. And the total amount of their cash savings, checking accounts, and investment net worth as of the day that they're filing the FAFSA. Once they've done that, then it's going to ask them to select the colleges they want their FAFSA sent to. They can add up to 20 colleges. And so if they're not sure what they're doing yet, that's okay. They can search for and add, once again, up to 20 colleges, either by searching by using the school name, or if they know the school code for the school they want to apply to, they can save themselves some typing and type in those digits instead. But either way, they'll click the search button there to have any related search results pop up, and then they can click to select the schools that they want added to their FAFSA. And once they've done all of that, they'll be asked to agree to the terms and conditions and sign their FAFSA. This is what those screens look like. So same sort of format as before. We have a summary in that green text box, some additional information about what signing the FAFSA entails, and then the checkbox where they can click the button to sign. If they started the form and are required to have contributor information, it'll only give them the option to sign at this point. If they are the last person adding their information, it will give them the option to sign and submit it. And we'll see that with the screenshots from the parent information. So this is that section. If they do have a contributor that needs to be added, they'll show up underneath the text box here. It'll show the contributor that they've added, and it'll show the status of if the invite was sent or if that section was completed. So coming back to this parent contributor email that we saw earlier, I'm going to pass it over to Danielle to talk us through the parent sections of the FAFSA.
Okay, so we're halfway through our deep dive. We're going to keep diving. Let's talk about the parent section on the FAFSA. Ginger covered what the student is going to see on their side, and we're going to cover what the parent is going to see. So can you go back to that slide real quick, Ginger?
Yeah, totally.
So once the student sends the parent the invite, they're going to be able to either log in through the email that they've received. So once that invite is sent, it will send it to the parent email that they listed on the FAFSA, or sorry, on the invite. And just to clarify, we've gotten this question quite a bit. Does the email address that the student enters have to match what the parent has entered on their ID when they've created that? And the answer is no. So the student can put any working email from the parent, and it doesn't necessarily have to match what the parent has set up through their studentaid.gov account. So they can click the link, or if they don't want to get into their email, they can simply log into the FAFSA. Next slide, please. So when they log into the FAFSA, they'll see this screen, and they'll be able to accept the invitation, which will take them to their section on the FAFSA. Go ahead. There we go. The parent will also be required to provide their consent and approval just like the student. And again, if they decline this consent, then the student is ineligible for federal student aid if they require a parent contributor on the FAFSA. So the student must provide their consent and approval to get through the process. So we've already kind of covered this information right at the very beginning. So we're going to cover it again because it's a lot of information to take in. The IRS Direct Data Exchange is going to happen behind the scenes once the contributor provides their consent and approval, and once they answer the marital status question and the tax filing status question. A match is going to happen on the back end, and it's going to search the IRS database to see if there's a tax record on file. If there is, it will automatically populate on the FAFSA. This won't be optional. I did have some parents ask if they could opt out, and there's no way to opt out. It is a direct data exchange, so there's no way to actually opt out of this. The fields transferred from the IRS will be hidden, and they're not correctable because they're coming directly from the IRS. If there is no match, the contributor will have to manually enter their information from the tax return. And this is again going to happen when that marital status doesn't necessarily match the tax filing status, if they filed taxes in a U.S. territory or foreign country, or if there's no tax record on file, or they're a victim of identity theft. If the match does happen, it's going to greatly reduce the financial questions that the student and parent have to answer, so much so that they might think that they're doing something wrong. So I had quite a few parents who were very confused that they got through the FAFSA in 10 minutes. And it's like, well, it didn't even ask me for my taxes. How does it know? And that is because that direct data exchange happened on the back end, and it significantly reduces the number of questions that the student and parent have to answer. It will also give them a little pop-up that says, "Success, we've confirmed your information with the IRS." And that's what that looks like. So once the parent logs in, they, just like the student, will be required to provide their demographic information, which will include their marital status and their state of legal residence. And if they begin the FAFSA before the student, so yes, they can begin the FAFSA before the student, they will be able to answer some student questions, such as the address, marital status of the student, college plans, and personal circumstances. The only thing that they won't be able to answer is anything beyond the student personal circumstances section. The rest of that does have to be completed by the student, but it is possible for this parent to start the FAFSA and to be able to answer some of the student questions in addition to the parent questions. So the parent financial section is going to be a combination of reporting income and assets, and we're going to start with income. So first, they're going to answer that marital status question and the tax filing question, and that's going to see if there's a match with the IRS, and they must match in order for that match to work. If there's no match, the parent will manually enter all of their tax return information, but if there is a match, they're only going to be asked to answer the following questions. They're going to be asked about federal benefits received. So that's if they have an earned income credit, which is on a tax return, if they received federal housing assistance, if their student has free and reduced school lunch, if they have Medicaid, refundable credits under a qualified health plan, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program or SNAP, Supplemental Security Income or SSI, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families or TANF, and Women, Infant, and Children WIC. So if they have any of those kind of government programs, those are all income based. So that's telling the FAFSA that they're low income if they have any of those benefits. And then the parent will be required to report any kind of IRA or pension rollover. The reason is it gets brought over from the IRS, and the IRS cannot differentiate between a rollover amount and not a rollover. So it will actually be included in the SAI or student aid index calculation. And the way to take it out is the parent has to report that it's a rollover amount, and that will take that out of the calculation. This is going to be rare if a parent themselves is in school and they have grants and scholarships that they reported on their tax return, they'll report them. But again, it's rare. I don't think I've ever seen that on a parent. If they have a foreign income exclusion on the tax return, that's also going to be rare, and they'll also report number in college. There also will be an option to update their family size if that information doesn't match the number of tax filers on the tax return. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So now we've talked about income, let's talk about the investments and assets. And we're definitely going to do a very, very deep dive on this. So just remember you have the slides that will be posted later for reference. So parents must report the following assets and investments. They're going to report child support received for the most recent completed calendar year. They're going to report the balance of their cash saving checking account balances. They're going to report their current net worth and the net worth of their business or farms. And net worth is going to equal the value of that investment minus any debt owed against that investment. So that is investment net worth. And if it's a negative value, they'll enter 0. So continuing on, I want to define what's going to be included in investments because this question does come up quite a bit. And the FAFSA does provide a nice list if you click on the question mark button while you're in the FAFSA. But generally speaking, investments are going to include any real estate except for the home they live in, any rental properties, vacation homes, trust funds, UGMA accounts, and UTMA accounts, money market funds, mutual funds, CDs, stocks, and bonds, and also 529 college savings accounts. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about 529 in just a minute because there's a weird thing with those. So investments are not going to include the home that the student and parent live in, or the spouse if the student is married, their cash saving and checking accounts, because remember, this question is already asked on the FAFSA. It asks for the balance of these accounts, so they don't want to double report it by including it in their investment net worth. Any ABLE accounts, the value of life insurance and retirement plans or pension funds and non-education IRAs. And in the case that a student does have the UGMA or UTMA account, those are considered assets of the student and are reported in the student section on the FAFSA form, regardless of the student's dependency status. So parents won't include these if they're the custodian, but not the owner. And then 529 accounts, this one is a little odd. It's backwards. So this one is always reported under the parent asset, not the student asset. So that even if the student is the beneficiary of a 529 plan, that will be reported under the parent. And also, if the parent has multiple students with 529 plans, they will only report the value of that 529 for the student in which they're completing the FAFSA for. So they won't include 529s for their other children. And if grandpa or grandma own the 529, it's just not going to be reported anywhere on the FAFSA. So that question has come up. So there is a stipulation for assets. So in the past, if you've been in this business for quite a while, you may remember that certain people did not have assets included on the FAFSA. They've kind of continued this, but they've modified it a little bit. So there are certain students and parents who will not actually have the assets counted against them on the FAFSA. They have to meet these qualifications, though. They will still report assets on the FAFSA, but they won't be included in the final student aid index calculation when that is done. So if the applicant qualifies for the maximum Pell Grant, if they have an adjusted gross income of less than $60,000, and that's the parents of a dependent student or an independent student, and they can't file any schedules. They also can select that they have those means tested benefits, which means that they've received those federal benefits during the 23 or 24 calendar year. So those again are those earned income credit free and reduced school lunch, housing assistance, things like that. So any family who meets this criteria, they don't have their assets included in the student aid index calculation. So here are some additional FAFSA questions. So now that we've covered income and assets, family size will be asked on the form, and it will be asked if the direct data exchange worked. It's only going to ask if the number is different than what was transferred from the IRS. So family size will automatically be pulled over from the direct data exchange. It's going to pull over the people listed as the tax filers. So if it's a joint return, it would pull over two. And then it's going to pull over any dependents listed on the tax return. And then it'll add the tax filers listed on the form plus the dependents listed, and that will be the family size that will be pulled over from the direct data exchange. So if something has changed in that family size, then that is an opportunity for the parent to correct the family size. So if they click no, then they can report the amended family size. They'll also be asked to report number in college. Some schools might use this for other purposes, but for federal purposes, this will not change the student aid index calculation. And then we talked already about 529 plans. They need to make sure they only report the value of the student listed on the FAFSA, and it will be reported under parent assets, not student. And then we're to the end. So the parents, just like the student, will be asked to sign and submit. And then after everything's been completed, the confirmation screen will show and it will tell them kind of their next little steps, that they'll get an email, the student can monitor their status, and that the student will eventually hear from their school. So diving further deeper here, we're going to talk about Pell Grants. And we're going to talk about Pell Grants in some depth because a lot of things have changed with the Pell Grant. So beginning with the 24-25 academic year, students can automatically qualify for a Pell Grant in several ways. So there are now 3 ways to qualify for the Pell Grant. Prior to 2 years ago, there was only one way you could qualify, and that was through the FAFSA calculation. But now there are 3 ways to qualify. A student can qualify for the maximum Pell Grant. It's going to be based on the state they live in, the tax filing status, if the parent is a single parent or not a single parent, the student's dependency status, the adjusted gross income, and then the poverty guidelines. So beginning with last year, the Pell Grant is really based on the poverty guidelines, and I'll show you a chart in just a second. If the student doesn't qualify for a maximum Pell Grant, they can still get a Pell Grant by filling out the FAFSA, of course, and qualifying via the Student Aid Index. So via their Student Aid Index, they still could potentially get a Pell Grant amount. And then the final way is if, let's say, they don't qualify for the maximum Pell Grant, let's say their Student Aid Index is too high to get a Pell Grant that way, they could still get a minimum Pell Grant based off the same factors: poverty chart, adjusted gross income, whether or not the parent is single or married, if the student is independent or dependent, the state they live in. So that student could still qualify for a minimum Pell Grant. And now I'm going to show you the charts. I know this is a lot of information, so take a deep breath. So Pell Grant is now going to be based on the poverty charts that are developed by the Health and Human Services organization. So if you're doing high school nights, I find these very helpful because I can take these charts out to a high school night. I can collect some information from the family, and I can tell them before they even file the FAFSA if they're going to qualify for a maximum or a minimum Pell Grant. So I want to go through an example. We need to know where the student lives. These are the charts for the lower 48 states. This does not include Alaska or Hawaii. I thought being in Kansas, we would be safe to exclude Alaska and Hawaii. I don't see a lot of students at our schools from there, but it does matter where they live. We also need to know if they're a dependent student or an independent student. And then we need to know if the parent is a single parent or if they're not a single parent, what their family size is, and their adjusted gross income. So let's use a single parent who has a child starting college at Washburn next year. So it's a family size of two, they're dependent, parent is single. If that parent makes less than $44,370, then that student will automatically qualify for the maximum Pell Grant. If that parent makes less than $64,090, then that student can qualify for a minimum Pell Grant. So that's pretty cool. They can get the Pell Grant. Of course, they're still going to file the FAFSA because you can't get any Pell Grant without the FAFSA. And depending on the student aid index calculation, they're going to get the best Pell that they can possibly get. So if they qualify for the minimum Pell Grant via this chart here, but the student aid index actually gives them a better Pell Grant amount, they're going to get the better Pell Grant amount, the larger amount. So let's go to married parents. So the parents are married. They have a child starting college at KU possibly. They've got a family size of three. If they make for the adjusted gross income, and I want to specify this only includes the parent adjusted gross income, not the student and the parent together. This is just the parent when they're a dependent student. So the student income doesn't matter for this. So if that family, two parents, make less than $43,505, then that student would qualify for a maximum Pell Grant. If those parents' adjusted gross income combined is less than $68,365, then that student would qualify at least for a minimum Pell Grant. But again, the FAFSA will give them the best Pell Grant possible. And then on the right, I won't go over these in as much detail, so we still have some material to get through. So I think the majority of us work with dependent students, but there are people out there that work with adult learners. So this would apply to um, students who do not put a parent on the FAFSA. There are scenarios for if the student is a single parent themselves, if they're not a single parent, and if the student's not a parent at all. So there are various scenarios based on family size and adjusted gross income for those students as well. All right, let's take a deep breath. We'll move on to the next slide, but I know we covered a lot of information about Pell Grants, more than you probably ever needed to know. I also want to mention that the Pell Grant now is based on enrollment intensity. So what this means is that the credit hours will determine the percentage of Pell Grant that a student receives. So if a student is not enrolled full-time, they can receive a Pell Grant. Notice it goes all the way down to 1 credit hour. That's a pretty big misnomer in our community is sometimes people think that you have to be full-time student to get a Pell Grant. That's not true at all. You can be enrolled in even 1 credit hour if you qualify for the Pell Grant. You'll still be able to get a portion of that Pell Grant. I also want to specify that this chart that you see is for a term-based school, so a fall, spring term-based school, not a quarter-based school. Schools that operate on the quarter system are actually going to have a different chart, but I believe most of the schools in the state of Kansas are term-based. So depending on how many credits the student enrolls in, their Pell Grant amount will be adjusted based on that. Next slide, please.
And now we're going to talk about what happens after the FAFSA is submitted. Unless Danielle, did you have anything else to add?
Nope, I was going to turn it over to you, Ginger.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So, once a student has submitted their FAFSA, and that includes any contributor information that need to be submitted as well, they'll have their FAFSA submission summary available. This will include an estimate for their federal student aid eligibility, including things like the Pell Grant, which Danielle just covered so thoroughly, and federal direct loans, as well as an estimate, once again, heavy emphasis on estimate of whether they would potentially be eligible for federal work study. That's what it covers on the eligibility overview. There's also a section to the FAFSA submission summary where students can review their FAFSA form answers, so answers to those questions. Maybe they did accidentally say yes to apply for a direct unsubsidized loan only when they meant no, and so they're getting an email from the school where they applied, and then they need to go in and change something. If they need to see the form answers, they can review that as part of the FAFSA submission summary. They can also submit a correction if they answered any of those questions incorrectly as of the date that the FAFSA was filed. The third tab will include school information so they can see where they've had their FAFSA sent. And then there's a fourth tab with next steps, including any necessary action for the student to take, like if a signature is missing or if someone, whether the student or the contributor needs to log in and provide that consent because they may not have it right away. And then once the FAFSA submitted also comes to the different schools that the student included on their form. So under normal circumstances, we should get those approximately 1 to 3 days after the FAFSA has been processed. And the financial aid office will have information for the student about whether any additional information is needed to complete their financial aid file. Financial aid offer timelines are a little bit up in the air, right? Because for so many years it's been the FAFSA opens up on October 1st. By the way, happy October 1st, even though this is not the day the FAFSA is opening this year. But in general, private schools, public schools, community colleges, and technical colleges have their own sort of pace of getting information out to students once they've gotten that FAFSA from them. And that should come with the asterisk that each school is going to do things in their own way. So although there may be some trends, doesn't mean each school is like locked into doing it the exact same way as every other type of school that they match. And students will typically be notified of next steps and whether their financial aid offer is available, either via email, via mail, and they may have access to that information through a financial aid dashboard or portal. When it comes to the different types of financial aid that may be included in a student's financial aid offer, we talked about the Pell Grant earlier. That's a primary example of a type of grant that students can receive. The Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, otherwise referred to as FED-SEOG or FSEOG, is also something that schools will review eligibility for based on the FAFSA. And then the Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education, or TEACH grant, is also a federal grant that students who are pursuing certain education programs may be eligible for if their school participates in that. And then state grants as well. So in the state of Kansas, we've got grant and scholarship information through the Kansas Board of Regents website. The Kansas Comprehensive Grant is a big example of that, but there are certainly others, and the KBOR website is a great place to become familiar with more of those. When I'm talking to students about grants and scholarships, I let them know that grants and scholarships are pretty synonymous. Both of those are funds that don't come with an expectation of repayment. So the only difference in most cases is that a grant will typically be from a governmental source or some really old scholarships may still be called grants just because that was the trendy language at the time. Now there's more of a separation in what people call their funds for students. And if they're not a governmental agency, they'll typically refer to themselves as scholarships, whether that's through the different schools that the student may be applying to, potentially through the state, and then private and third party or outside scholarships. So it's not a school, it's not the government, it's just an organization or a foundation or an individual who's got a scholarship available for students. And different schools will have different information about accessing those outside or third party or private scholarships. Loans do require repayment. It's a little less fun to talk about, but there are a few different types of loans that students may see listed on their financial aid offer from a school. Two of those most common types of loans that we talk about with students are the federal direct subsidized loan and the federal direct unsubsidized loan. The big difference between those two is that the subsidized loan isn't accruing interest while the student's in school and 6 months after they graduate or drop below half-time, which is when repayment would begin. Eligibility for that is determined based on what the FAFSA calculates as well as other parts of a student's financial aid offer, since it is a form of need-based aid. The federal direct unsubsidized loan is something that's offered to any students who still have federal student loan eligibility. So if you're a first-time college student hasn't taken out any federal student loans before, you're definitely going to be eligible for that if the school you're attending participates in the federal student loan programs. The other type of loans that students may see included in their financial aid offer as a result of filing the FAFSA through the federal student aid program is the parent loan for undergraduate students, otherwise referred to as a PLUS loan. And that may show up as an estimate rather than an offer, depending on how the school has formatted their financial aid offer letter. This is a loan that does require an additional application from the parent of a dependent undergraduate student, and that application is through the federal student aid website, so they'll log in with the same studentaid.gov account credentials in order to potentially apply for the loan. The studentaid.gov website is also a great place for more information about those loan options. And then private loans are loans that are not through the federal student aid program, so many financial institutions offer student loans, and the amount of information that's available through each school will vary on whether they have a historical lender list or a preferred lender list. So if a student is this far in the financial aid process and want to learn more about those, they can definitely work with the financial aid administrator at any of the schools that they're interested in attending to learn more about what options are available to them as a student at that school. And then there are two types of work study programs which enable students to earn money for work that they're doing either on a campus or through certain off-campus partnership programs. And that's the federal work study program, and then Kansas has a work study program as well. Another important step that comes after students file the FAFSA is verification. And this isn't a process that everyone has to go through, but if you are selected for it, you do have to complete the verification process in order to be eligible for federal financial aid, as well as some other forms of financial aid, depending on the state and the institution. But it's essentially a process to make sure that the information that was provided on the FAFSA is accurate. The direct data exchange is making students less likely to be selected for verifying that financial information because we're getting it direct from the source. The selection process is random, and so if a student is trying to figure out why they were selected, it isn't because they did anything wrong. It's a completely random process. And one way they can know if they're selected for verification is an asterisk next to their student aid index in the FAFSA submission summary. It'll also appear as a comment in the application status section, and schools will be reaching out to let the student know, hey, here's the information that we need from you in order to move forward with preparing your financial aid offer and determining your financial aid eligibility. So if selected students and if they are having any contributors on their form, those families will need to provide the requested documents to the college in order to move forward with understanding their financial aid options. I mentioned a couple of slides ago about the ability to make a correction on the FAFSA form if information was answered or provided incorrectly at the time the FAFSA was filed. However, if the information was correct, because in this case, we're looking at 2023 information, but since then, there have been a change in circumstances, such as loss of income or reduction in wages, the separation, divorce, or death of a parent or spouse, medical or dental expenses that exceed certain federal thresholds, and siblings or dependents or parents enrolled in college are all examples of circumstances that you wouldn't indicate on the FAFSA at first, but you can work with the school's financial aid office in order to discuss the process, as it does vary from school to school. But the financial aid administrators at each school will let you know or let your students know what the options are if the information from the FAFSA doesn't match their circumstances at this point. Now, talking about some common issues that we've seen, we've mentioned a few of these throughout the slides, but that unsubsidized loan only question has been really tricky for folks. And so a lot of phone calls that I know I made this summer, we're just checking in with people about, hey, did you mean to say that you're applying for the unsubsidized loan only? If the answer is yes, we've got a process for that, but in most cases it was nope. I must have answered that wrong, so talking them through that correction. Same goes for the first bachelor's degree question answered incorrectly. It's going to ask them about their high school completion status, and it's going to ask them if they've earned a first bachelor's degree by the time they're starting this semester. And that's because different types of financial aid are only available to first-time degree-seeking students, so students who haven't already earned a bachelor's. We've seen a lot of issues with the parent invites, and so making sure that everything matches exactly, especially for students whose parents don't have social security numbers. The student circumstances, as we looked at, it's a lot of bullet points, and some of those are very wordy on the FAFSA form. So sometimes I'm meeting with a student because they're telling me, hey, I can't provide this parent information. And as they're telling me their story, I'm realizing, oh, well, it sounds like you actually fit into this category here on this section of the form. So in that case, being able to make a correction so that it reflects their independent student status rather than, going through those additional steps of an unusual circumstance. Um, or something a student is totally surprised of like, oh, I didn't realize that this was actually included in this option. When it comes to paper FAFSAs, it's really a last resort, or ideally not at all. And that's because there have been all sorts of data issues and they are taking forever to process. So as if the process of filling it out with pen to paper and putting in the mail wasn't already difficult and ambiguous enough. If something is wrong in the process, they can't correct it via paper if they've included an email address and they're prompted to do it online, but maybe it can't be corrected online. So although they were not ideal before because of just timing issues with the better FAFSA, we're just seeing that this really should be a last resort. They really want everyone to be able to do it online. And so avoiding that as much as possible is going to be at least what I'm working with a student to try to get that FAFSA submitted. And then there are issues with changes or corrections to marital status that can't currently be corrected by the school. I mean, we're seeing, sort of this soft launch extended rollout with the 2024-25 FAFSA. We're still getting updates about things that, 2 weeks ago seemed impossible. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but it is an issue. And so making sure that students and their contributors are reporting things accurately when they're filling out the form can help them avoid any headaches with potentially errors not letting them change the marital status or letting their schools change the marital status down the line. And then circling back to what we talked about in the very beginning of when you're creating your studentaid.gov account, it is surprising how many issues can come up when a student or their contributor is logging in as both, and as a role-based form, it does its job as best as it can to keep track of, like, you're the student, so you're entering the student information, you're the parent, you're entering parent information. But when people are logging in as each other, that gets messy really quickly. And I actually sat with a student for like 20 minutes a couple weeks ago before we figured out that the student and the student's dad, who share the same first name, had their account information mixed up. And that was because in an effort to be helpful, someone created someone else's account. But here we are in September trying to figure out why it hasn't gone through. These are some of the additional resources that are available to you that we think could be helpful related to getting in depth with the FAFSA. The Federal Student Aid, or FSA, Training Center has options for you to log in as a guest to really, get into more about the FAFSA, those formulas. If the Pell charts with Danielle were your favorite part of the presentation, this is going to be a great resource for you, and just processes for financial aid. You can also access the 2025-26 FAFSA prototype, which is where we got our screenshots today. You'll just want to type in prototype 2526 when you're prompted for the access code. Some toolkits and additional resources are available through the National College Attainment Network Better FAFSA Training Toolkit and the FSA Toolkit for Counselors, such as many of you in the audience today. And then last but not least, one I reference quite frequently is the FAFSA Issues Alert page, because that is where they're publishing known issues and whether or not there are any workarounds that students can utilize as they're trying to complete the form, as well as their contributors. So thank you so much for joining us for this session, our first of the FAFSA and financial aid training series this year. We do hope that you'll save the date for our additional trainings, but if you aren't able to make it, once again, the recordings and slides will be available to folks, and this is the same QR code that you probably got via email and maybe even a postcard in the mail. Seen it earlier in the slide, so we're trying to get the word out. If there's anyone who you think, hey, you would benefit from this too, feel free to share it with them because at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that financial aid is a team sport. And so the more people we have playing on our team with good information about how to help students and their families file the FAFSA, the better off we're all going to be as we help students figure out what's next for them when they're getting ready to finish high school. So now we'll open up the floor for any questions. And actually, why don't I just check in with Kevin real quick? How are the questions from the chat? Do we have any that would be helpful to start by answering? Or
Yeah, so I think for the most part, all of the questions that I've seen come across have been answered in the chat directly. But if we have other questions that have not yet been answered or anything new that is popping up, um, anybody feel free to chime in. Okay, so we do have a couple questions. Will we be able to get a copy of the Pell chart that was shared? So it looks like people are looking for the Pell Grant poverty chart, um, which I believe should be accessible through the PowerPoint.
Mhm.
The slides will be shared, so the slides will be made available. Keep an eye out for correspondence from CASFA about that. Um, so yeah, it will be made available. Any other questions?
If we don't have questions, Kevin, let's go through the questions in the chat. So that might
Sure.
prompt others if they have questions and read them and give the answers since we do have a few minutes.
Sure. One sec. So I'm for whatever reason my scrolling is kind of messing up on the chat. So hopefully we have not missed any. But the first question that we got, just making sure I am correct. If a student is being fostered by a relative and it started prior to 13, then they need one of their foster parents to be a contributor. Um, this would be correct only if the student has been legally adopted by the foster parent. If they were not legally adopted by the foster parent, they would not list the foster parents on the FAFSA. Does it
We get
matter
this
which of,
question a lot. Oh, go ahead,
sorry?
Kevin.
No, go ahead.
We get this question a lot with legal guardianship too. They want to put their legal guardian, who is not and a legal guardian, by the way, cannot be the parent, the biological parent. And they want to list their legal guardian, and they would not do that if they are actually in a legal guardianship. They would be independent.
Correct. Yeah, very good point, Danielle. So we have another question. Does it matter which of the divorced parents claim the student on income taxes, even if the student lives with the other parent? Um, Danielle's response, it doesn't matter who claims the student on the tax return, it's who is providing the majority of the support, regardless of where the student lives. The student will have to determine which parent provides the most financial support and report information for that parent. If they claim they equally support the student, then the student will report the parent with the greater amount of income or assets. We do have one new message. Will there be any trainings for TRIO/Gear Up programs to complete the homeless youth determination? That I am not positive about. Ginger, Danielle, do either of you know?
If you get a hold of Rebecca Dukestein, I usually provide that training for Trio Gear Up, and I've not heard from her, but if you want to reach out to her and ask, I can also reach out as well, but that's something she usually coordinates for Trio Gear Up, at least in the Kansas City area. I don't know about Wichita or Manhattan.
Yep, and Rebecca is an awesome contact. She's a great person.
And we will have a FAFSA, or sorry, we just did the FAFSA deep dive. I'm still underwater. We will have another deep dive. I put in the chat the wrong date. I corrected it. It is March 4th. We'll do a deep dive on homeless youth, special or unusual circumstances when they can't list a parent, dependency overrides, kind of those issues that we didn't have enough time to really dive into today. But that is a lot of questions that come up, especially for TRIO folks and guidance counselors on when the student cannot list a parent on the FAFSA. But we will have another deep dive session in March on that.
Excellent, thank you. We had another question. Is it always 2 years prior for tax information? Yes, that is correct. As of, I believe, 2015 is when they went to prior year. Since that time, it has been 2 years prior for tax information on the FAFSA.
I'll just add that if there have been any changes to the financial circumstances, either, in the preceding year or in the 2025 year for the case of the 25-26 FAFSA, students should always reach out to their financial aid office to discuss what the process would look like in order to have that information reflected on their FAFSA rather than the prior year data. I explain it to folks as like taking a Polaroid picture, spits it out right away. Some people don't change that much in 2 years. They look exactly like that photo. But sometimes there can be a lot of changes. And so the special circumstances process is the designated way to update that, even though you may go into the FAFSA knowing 2023 is not reflective of the situation. Just get it in there and then work with your schools in order to update it accordingly.
Excellent. Thank you, Ginger. We had another question. Do parents report free/reduced lunch if their child attends a school where all students receive free lunch, even if they would not independently or individually qualify for said benefit? No, they would not. So per the Department of Ed, this does not include free meals that were served to children whose families do not meet the U.S. Department of Agriculture's household income and guidelines, but who attend a school that provided free meals because of the district's eligibility or a community eligibility provision in a low income area. So the individual does have to meet that requirement based on their own family household income. Next question, if a student is living with a relative but their parents reside in another country, the parent will still have their own account, but will have to report income separately. We have, let me Yeah, so in this case, parent income would not be able to be pulled in using the DDX, the direct data exchange, because there would not be a US tax return on file. They will have to enter their parent information manually. What if their parents are not providing any financial assistance, but the relative they live with is the sole financial provider? Unless the student has been adopted by the relative or otherwise are considered independent, you would still have to provide their biological parents' financial info. And then Danielle, you provided the follow-up. Another sticking point with parents who live overseas is that both parents will have to create an account and provide their information, consent, and approval, which is difficult in a lot of ways. But it will likely require some work with the school to make sure that you kind of know exactly what you need.
Yeah, these
Um,
situations are very tough, especially when the parents are in another country. But I do want to also state that in the case where the parents are displaced, and it's not possible for the student to contact the parent because maybe the student is a refugee, there is a way that the student could talk to the school. There might be a way that we could do what's called a dependency override, where we do allow the student to forego parent information and just list the student information. But their parents, kind of what I'm thinking is maybe if they're in the Ukraine or Afghanistan, or now I guess Lebanon or Palestine, like places where
sure.
there's war or there's not a normal means by which the student can contact their parent.
Very good point, Danielle. We have another question. The tax information is entered from the 2023 year, but what about the child support received and federal benefits during the 2023 year or 2024? It is for the last complete calendar year. So if they filed the FAFSA on December 1st, 2024, they would report any child support received for January 2023 through December 2023. So for the last completed calendar year.
And I didn't realize this was a two-parter, so that's just referring to the child support. But on the FAFSA, it's going to ask for means tested benefits for either 23 or 24. But for child support, it's very different. It's the last complete calendar year just for that child support received.
Thank you. We had another question. How does work study apply to aid? Does it vary college to college? It definitely does vary. There are some requirements that have to be met that all colleges have to align with, but work study is available first and foremost to students who demonstrate financial need. It is a need-based form of financial aid, so it does have to be offered to students with financial need. Need for schools purposes is defined by subtracting a student's student aid index from their cost of attendance. So when their student aid index is larger than their cost of attendance, in most cases, they won't qualify for work study unless it's some type of institutional funded program.
I've also heard, like when I'm talking with students and families, a perception that any on-campus employment is work study, which sure, yeah, if you're not living in the depths of financial aid the way we are, it makes perfect sense. But when we're talking about eligibility for federal or state or institutional work study, many campuses will have opportunities for students to work on campus, whether or not they're federal work study eligible. And so often, websites with student employment opportunities will specify whether or not federal work study is required in order for those positions posted. So I'd like to let people know that even if you're not federal work study eligible, you may still be able to get a job on campus, unless it says it requires federal work study. And then part of the question that I'm not sure if we answered is um, also, as Kevin mentioned, something that can vary from institution to institution, but at least at the schools I've worked at, the federal work study funds go directly to the student. And then if they want to turn it around and pay it towards their balance at the university, they absolutely can. But it's also, available to them if they need to use it for those indirect education related expenses like books and supplies they're getting off campus, food. So that one's a little bit unusual compared to other forms of financial aid like grants, scholarships, and loans, since those will typically be applied to the student's balance or charges at the university first.
And the way to think about it is the student is just they're getting a job and they're working and they're earning a paycheck.
Right.
So like at Johnson County Community College, our payment is due before the semester starts. So there's not any possible way a student could use work study to pay their bill because their bill is due before they start working. Now, if they work throughout the fall semester and save money, then they could use that money to pay for the spring semester. But they again would have to use it and actually physically make a payment. At least that's the way it is at our institution.
And the reason some people say, well, then why is it even considered like a form of financial aid? And that's because the federal work study piece that, differentiates it from if you were working an on-campus job without any form of work study and you were being paid directly from an institution's budget. The federal work study program is an incentive for campuses to offer employment opportunities to the students who need those funds the most. So really, it's an incentive for different offices on campus to create opportunities for students who need that additional financial assistance. But when I'm talking to students about it, at the end of the day, like it's not a difference in the amount you're earning. Um, it is going to come to you in most cases in the form of a paycheck. And so um, it winds up sounding a lot more complicated than it is when a student
Mhm.
works their hours, gets their paycheck, and then chooses what to do with that money.
And the way it benefits the student is it's not included as income on the FAFSA. So behind the scenes, there's a process that's going to run where if the student did file taxes, but most of that was work study, the school's going to report the amount of work study and it's going to subtract it from the FAFSA. So it's going to look like if that was their only job, that the student didn't actually earn an income and not have that calculate in the student aid index. Also, fewer taxes get taken out of their paycheck. It's not a lot, it's like a couple dollars here and there, but I can't remember the specific tax, but there's one tax that does not come out of their paycheck. So they get a little bit more, but again, it's not anything to sing home about.
Right. Good points all around. We do have a new question. When are students and parents able to start completing the FAFSA? The 24-25 FAFSA is open right now and can be completed at any time. But the 25-26 FAFSA is currently scheduled to open on or before December 1st. Let's kind of backtrack a little bit, see if we missed any. So we had a question kind of just about how unaccompanied youth is defined and at risk of being homeless. So students, sorry, one sec. Is it just a student living with someone other than a parent or guardian? Do they have to be unaccompanied and at risk of being homeless, or just one or the other? Um, they have to be both unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being homeless. Unaccompanied in this case means they are not in the physical custody of their parent. So if the student and parent are both in a shelter, they would report their parent information because they are still in the physical custody of their parent. We had a follow-up to that. I guess I'm wondering if the student is not in the custody of their parents and stays with friends or family, even though there is no alternate guardianship arrangements, that would be considered at risk of being homeless, right? Because there is no adult assuming responsibility for their care. They could potentially be considered at risk if the friends or other family kick them out of this house. In this case, the student would need to answer yes to that homeless question and meet with the school's financial aid office. And that is something that is going to be really helpful to bring to the deep dive on March 15th.
Sorry, March 4th. That was the wrong date I put in there.
March
I
4th, my
clarified
apologies.
later.
So yes, there will be a deep dive on that on March 4th.
And
And
Kevin, I
Then there
think that
was a
brings us to time.
that does
Mhm.
bring us to time, and I think that got all the questions as well. So yeah, thank you everybody very much for attending. Big thanks to Ginger McBride. Big thanks to Danielle Sullivan. You guys are the best. And we will be following up with attendees with some additional correspondence about how to access these slides later on. So keep an eye out for that. And we hope to see you at our next events.